The 2020 Grand Cask has probably way more stories than any wine I've ever made. And I think that stems directly from, of course, the displeasure of all of us having to go through something like the year 2020. It was, as we all know, just a mess from start to finish. But for those of us in the wine industry who were considered essential workers in those days, we still had something to look forward to, and that was harvest. We knew that this craziness, or we hoped, that craziness would pass. We would have grapes start to roll in, we would start to make wine, and it would start to feel a little bit more normal. At least that's where my mindset was at. I figured everything else, all the craziness that's going on this year, at least I get to make wine. That became just the focal point of everything. Fast forward to the harvest season, and the growing season, for all intents and purposes, was looking pretty good. A little warm, a little dry, but it was looking like it was going to be a pretty solid vintage out of Napa. Then we saw the smoke start to roll in from fires, I believe, up in Oregon and elsewhere in California. We had a fire that was kind of hit the eastern side of Napa, but pushed away from us out towards Vacaville and Fairfield. A lot of smoke in the area, but at that point in time, I think all of us were still holding on to our butts saying, you know what, as long as our lab results come back, as long as the fermentations look, smell, taste good, we can still make great wine. This is going to be an interesting year to say the least, but at least we can get through this. And then the glass fire happened, and Napa Valley was just engulfed, in flames once again. And it was tough. It was really, really tough. We, very luckily enough, all of our Pinot Noir had already been here at the winery. We had barreled that down. It was in the caves already. Our Cabernet, however, was still going through fermentation. This had come in maybe a few days before the glass fire started. It was about a third of the way or a quarter of the way through the fermentation process. It had been fermenting for all of maybe 4 or 5 days at that point. And when that fire started and spread, all of a sudden we lost access to the winery. Before that, our harvest operations were pretty normal. We hand harvested all the fruit, brought it in, hand sorted through it once again, destemmed it and crushed it into 1-ton fermentation bins. Because I typically do, for small lots, and especially our high-end wines, try to do, be very hands-on, a little bit more delicate with those lots. So all the punch downs are done by hand if we get our shoulder workout in that time of year. So we were, manually we mix up those fermentations. We cover them, with some lids just to make sure that they stay kind of safe and stable. We check them twice a day, early in the morning and at night. We do the punch downs at that time as well. So it's a very hands-on process for this wine. And once the fires rolled through, we didn't have access to the winery for about 4 days. And at that point, the worry becomes, okay, hopefully the fermentations just continue. Because the nice thing about checking up on your wines every morning and every night is that if you smell or taste a potential issue, you can nip it in the bud. You can fix it right away. It's kind of a great way to just practice preventative medicine in your winemaking, is just check up on the kids every once in a while, make sure they're not getting into too much trouble. But when you don't have the opportunity to do that for 4 days during what is arguably the most volatile time in a wine's life, you start to get a little bit stressed. So we finally do make it back out here to the winery. It's driving through an active fire zone into town and back to get here. A little bit stressful, but for all intents and purposes, as safe as it could be with all the fire crews that were driving around. And we realized that the caps, because typically what happens through the fermentation for your reds is that the skins and seeds all float to the top, and you push those down with those punch downs to mix up that fermentation because you want to get good extraction from the skins and the seeds. You want to mix up that fermentation so it's happening evenly. It helps dissipate some of the heat that builds up. There's just a lot of little things that it does to really make sure that you're getting everything that you want from those grapes that are in that fermentation. What happens when you don't mix that up or you don't keep that cap wet is that it dries out. And at that stage, it's basically useless. This is when you start having to worry about things like VA, volatile acidity and acetic acid, which basically is your wine turning to vinegar. You can measure that so you know if you have a problem, luckily enough. But it's something that's your first thought. It's like, okay, these things have been left on their own devices. These caps have dried out. There is a potential VA issue. Let's start mitigating that as much as possible. On top of that, given the smoke that was in the area, we didn't want to do a super heavy pressing cycle, because if there were any smoke particles still on the skins, we did wash them off prior to crushing the grapes, something that we instituted in 2020, and it helped immensely because you could just see the ash running off as we rinsed off all of our fruit from that year. So we'd already rinsed off all the fruit, but we still didn't want to press too hard just in case there are any residual things. Because as you press harder and harder, you are breaking down the skins, you are breaking down the seeds, and bits and pieces of them can break off. More and more sediment usually ends up in the wine the harder you press. So from that stage, we really wanted to mitigate that as well. We measure our pressing cycles in atmospheres, or bars, for all the scuba divers out there. And it's typically we press to about maybe 1 bar, 1.5 bars, somewhere in that range, depending on what things taste like and what they smell like. The harder you press, typically you get a lot more bitter characteristics, you get a lot more astringency in the wine. So typically at about 1 bar, 1.2 bars, I'm really paying attention to what's going on to make sure that I'm getting the flavor profile and the structure that I want. In this year, in 2020, we cut that off at about 1/2 bar, just to make sure that we didn't press too hard and extract anything that we didn't want. So with all of that taken into account, we ended up with about 1/3 of the yields that we normally would. One, we couldn't go back out and harvest more fruit. There was just no way to go and continue picking at that stage. And two, we were just being extra careful. And it just resulted in not having a whole lot of juice to go around. So when it was all said and done, we probably had 4 barrels of Cabernet after the 2020 season. And as is tradition, what I typically do is all of our wines go into neutral oak first, barrels that have been used at least once, if not 2 or 3 times. And I let them sit and finish their malolactic fermentation in those barrels before racking them into their newer barrels where they will spend the rest of their life. So at this point, after getting through harvest, we get into November. Some of our best friends and us, we go down to Southern California for a little getaway. At that point, I top up all the barrels and I basically say, see ya until January. So for most of the month of December, I'm not really out at the winery too much. We are preparing for a bottling run in February typically, but that's something that, is typically I can do kind of remotely. I don't have to be here until as we get closer to the bottling run. So I'm able to kind of take a little break. And that was much needed after that 2020 season. And it was one of those things where I really wanted to kind of keep the wines out of sight, out of mind. They tasted good, they smelled good. Before I left, I figured they're on the right path. I'm gonna check in on them after the holidays and after the new year, and it's gonna be fine. But there was just that trepidation of, there's this chance that they could have a smoke taint issue, and this, all the wine that we have from this season could just not be any good. But that was the risk we decided to take. So I come back in January, I taste through all the barrels, and no lie, broke down crying because all the wine tasted phenomenal. It was beautiful. It was everything that it needed to be, especially given the season that we had, the year that we had to have some wine that we could actually be proud of from the 2020 season was just an immense joy. At that point, out of the 100 cases of Cabernet that we were gonna bottle up, I start tasting through those individual barrels and saying, okay, is any of this actually good enough to cut from the herd and make that barrel select style of wine from, not go back into, you know, our red blend or not go back into our Napa Valley Cabernet. And there was a barrel in particular that stood out of the crowd. So we put that juice into a brand new barrel. It was a Darnajou medium plus toast barrel. It sat in that barrel from January of 2021 all the way until February of 2023. So it was a very solid 2 years in that new barrel, and then, you know, a little bit of a difference in a neutral barrel just to let that finish up the malolactic fermentation and everything right after harvest. So it ended up being about 28 months in total when it came down to the barrel aging side of things. It was bottled in February of 2023 and eventually released in November of 2023. So it was a long haul making this wine. There are a couple very specific yeast strains that I use, one specifically to really enhance the structure of the wine, and another to really enhance the fruit characteristics. Being that it comes from the valley floor within Napa Valley, it needs a little bit of that extra backbone, but I also want to accentuate some of those great kind of plush characteristics that valley floor Cabernet tends to have. It's a wine that is actually very restrained, given the season and just what is typical of Napa Valley Cabernet. It's definitely that wine that if you're looking to age something, this is going to go that 10, 15, 20 plus year range, no doubt about it. It was an absolute joy, as stressful as it was, an absolute joy to make. It is got these just lovely dark fruit characteristics. The barrel characteristics intermingle with them just so well. It's this nice balance between the oak aging as well as the just natural characteristics of Cabernet Sauvignon that grape provides, especially coming from here in Napa. I couldn't be happier with this end result, given the challenges that the 2020 season had to offer. From there, this is a wine that I do suggest, if you're not going to be hanging on to it, you're going to open it a little sooner rather than later. It could benefit from a little decant. If you do have a decanter handy, or pour yourself a proper glass, then put the cork back in and shake it up a little bit. That'll do you solid as well, if you don't want to be too fancy about it. It is a wine that we did not do any heavy fining or any heavy filtration on, which I was very thankful that we didn't have to do any additional manipulation or processing in this wine, especially given the challenges that we saw in 2020. It's something that I'm very proud to say that I was as hands-off as I possibly could be, given what the season was doing and what Mother Nature provided from that particular year. This is the first vintage of the Grand Cask Cabernet. It was a hell of a challenging year to start in on this label and this new style of wine that I really hadn't toyed with too much before, but I like a challenge, so it was well worth it in the end. So I hope you have the chance to enjoy it. This 2020 vintage is certainly no slouch, despite the trials and tribulations that we had to go through that particular year. Again, couldn't be happier with the end result, and very thankful that we've got some good wine out of what was a very, very challenging year.